Hi guys, today we're going to finish up our lecture that started talking about animal populations by reviewing speciation, which you should have received in biology, and then ending on some notes about biodiversity. Let's skip ahead through the lecture to new information, but all of this is important for how we categorize the populations we find. So when we're discussing speciation, we're talking about how biological evolution works. Populations, okay, are going to change over time in their environment as the ones that are most successful to the environment reproduce more often. It's really important you remember we are not talking about individuals, that we're talking about big populations of the same species. And for the purposes of this discussion, species are or populations are groups of species that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. So biological evolution occurs for a couple of reasons. First, there's always some kind of variations within the species of a population in terms of their DNA. Not all individuals are alike. Otherwise, when environmental conditions change, everyone will be wiped out. We get these new variations through mutations. These can occur, due to environmental factors like intense UV radiation, and it can also, occur because of, natural human-induced causes, chemicals, radiation. Most individuals are going to produce more offspring than the environment can support, or the population at least will produce more than the environment can support. And so there'll be a competition within the same species and also between different populations of species for limited resources. Those that are better at finding the resources they need to reproduce are going to be the ones that survive more often and pass along their genes. So the genetics will have a higher frequency of traits that are fit for the environment. So it's this constant play between the environment and the variation between a population that leads individuals to be better fit for the current environment. It's really important to remember that new species form gradually. So these species, we're talking about geologic time here, not human scale time. This might be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. We have many forms of evidence for speciation. Fossils were the first, and gave us a lot of information about when species emerged, when they disappeared, which indicated large-scale extinctions, how species changed over time. They also give us a glimpse into past environments, the pollens present, higher proportions of marine organisms when land organisms entered the picture. DNA is probably our most recent evidence and has allowed us to confirm a lot of what we had been seeing in the fossil record, which species are more related to others. You would imagine that since we all share the same alphabet, A, T, C's, and G's, nitrogen bases, that those with more DNA in common are more similarly related or, more recently in geologic time form new species. So if you look at, take us and a banana, for instance, we have a lot of DNA in common, about 50% or more. But that other 50% obviously makes for some big differences. And the more closely an organism is, the more DNA they'll have in common. Some of the most convincing evidence, I think, is from what we've been doing to other species. We selectively breed organisms for the trait that we like to the point where they're no longer recognizable as the species that they started with initially. It's called selective breeding. We take traits that we prefer, we allow those individuals to mate, and the others don't get to mate. Artificial selection is the selective breeding in action. Many of our green vegetables all originated from a wild mustard plant, so like broccoli is related to kale. And over time, we took individuals out of a large, generation. We took a few individuals that had, the best greens that were tender or the biggest florets, and we let those mate under our artificial selection of traits, we were able to develop new species over time. GMOs add an interesting new possibility. Now we have taken DNA that codes for specific traits in totally unlike species and inserted that DNA that creates certain proteins into species that wouldn't otherwise have them. So here we can create corn that has the traits from certain bacteria that are resistant to pesticides. So these aren't necessarily totally new species yet. They might still be able to mate with the previous species, but we are modifying individuals in ways that nature couldn't have done. For instance, taking bacteria and combining it with corn, or fish and combining it with tomatoes. So we're mixing up the DNA across different families. So some ways speciation can occur can be geographic isolation. Here, this one population is divided by some kind of barrier. It could be a river or a mountain range. And over time, as mutations appear and traits get amplified for different environments, they become so dissimilar that if they were joined again, they may not be the same species anymore, meaning they may not be able to mate and produce viable offspring. Remember, this is happening on geologic time, continents separating, mountains rising, climate change of, the geologic past, not the current climate change, but, where there are hundreds of years cycles instead of just, 250 to 300 year cycles. I put this plate tectonics in here just to kind of remind you of that scale. So, 225 million years ago, there was one large continent, Pangaea. And as that broke up over time, you had some major geographic isolation of populations. You also had the opening up of new habitat, which allows organisms to kind of evolve more rapidly. So, millennia of evolution and speciation have led to some patterns that we can see. And we can see some of these patterns of biodiversity, or how many different species are present. One of them is the latitudinal gradient, and that is that the closer you move here to the equator, the higher biodiversity will become. There are many different ideas about why this might be. Some is temperature itself, that it allows, for just more stability and speciation. Some of it is that the tropics have been around longer in terms of geographic time, so there's been more time to evolve new species. And some of it is that species, their kind of population structure closer to the equator and in the tropics are, they're going to have more generations more quickly than species up here. And so because they're going to have more generations more quickly, they can adapt to changing environments faster. By reproducing more rapidly, or more generations per year, it also increases the likelihood of mutations. And then, the tropics themselves might lead to more specialized species just because there are a wider variety of niches than there might be up in, some of the habitats we're more familiar with. Because, sorry, kids are joining me on this. Because of that, it's important to remember, while this might be the greatest area of biodiversity, there are still very biodiverse areas outside of that. And some of those are the greatest under threat. So these hot spots here that are kind of highlighted in red, you can see some in California and in Mexico, across Europe, and into Southeast Asia. They're kind of all over. These hot spots are defined as areas of high biodiversity, and they have to meet two qualifications. Qualifications means that they are highly threatened and that they have endemic species that cannot be found elsewhere in the world. So that is to say, if you lost the populations here in Northern Africa, you're not going to find them necessarily anywhere else. And so they'll be lost for good on the global area. So we can talk about biodiversity globally. We can talk about regional hotspots, and we can talk about the tropics, which have higher levels of specialized species. It's important to remember that not all species have the same impact on the ecosystem. Some that have a really important impact are called keystone species, and those keystone species, if lost, can dramatically impact an area. The effect varies depending on who they are. Some are top predators, keeping herbivores in check so that they don't have boom and bust cycles that are quite so dramatic. Some, like phytoplankton and zooplankton in the ocean, they're the base of food chains. And so if you lose some of these really productive producers, you might disrupt everything that comes after it in terms of primary and secondary consumers. And then lastly, you have engineers, like the coral that we talked about. So let's look at some examples. You have beaver, elephants, another famous engineer, wolves, which are top predators, and in being so really impact elk, which then impact other herbivores, which impact producers. And you have coral. Beavers are going to create areas for spawning for fish, and this allows fish populations to be higher. It also allows other organisms to come and hunt the fish. It also slows bank erosion of the river and can buffer the impact of certain major flood events. Elephants will remove trees, allowing grasses to grow at higher populations, which in turn supports other herbivores, not just themselves. So both of these engineers can radically change landscapes. And then the wolves do the same thing because they consume some of the larger herbivores. They allow shrubs and woody flowers to grow, and they stabilize the banks of the river and allow kind of a higher diversity of herbivores to exist than would otherwise be there. Let's go back really quickly because I feel like without talking about coral, I'd be doing you a disservice. These are some of the populations that are supposed to most radically change with climate change. And I really want to talk about it. It's an animal that it has bacteria living on the surface of it. And as they grow, they provide habitat for other species, R-related fish species and, higher consumer fish that then eat those fish and top predators too. Without coral, the entire food chain collapses, and they actually create structures that provide homes. So in losing the animal and bacteria symbiosis and the destruction of the corals, we're going to lose a lot of other species. We're going to come in the next lecture to talk about biodiversity again and how we predict that extinctions will occur and some of the things we can do to prevent those extinctions.